she's here for the program, also here this morning to give us a talk on, on achieving meaningful privacy and some of the work she's done along those lines. And then we'll have a more technically focused sort of short course for the remaining 3/4 of the day after that. So yeah.
Morning, everybody. A few thank yous. I wanted to thank the Simons Institute for hosting this special program. I also want to thank the organizers of the program for this moment of weakness in which they decided to include a philosopher in the midst. I'm really excited to be here and to follow the great talks yesterday. As you probably may have guessed, I couldn't follow a lot of the technical work, but I do often choose to sit in technical talks because even in grasping some of the aspects, whatever percentage it is in any given talk, allows me to do what Kobe talked about yesterday, and I'm going to continue Kobe's bridge analogy to say that I talk from my philosophical language, from the philosophical, ethical perspective, but in order to create that bridge, it's really important for me to be able to just absorb some of the concerns that the technical community has. And in that spirit, I'm now continuing your metaphor to death. Whenever you build a bridge, you have to sink the piers. So yesterday we saw some of that happening, and today I'm going to do something of that and use the time that I have today to talk mainly about the theory of contextual integrity that some of you may know, some of you may wish you'd never heard about it, but hopefully that will be the start of a broader conversation. Now, what was it that stimulated the theory of contextual integrity? It was this. A lot of philosophers in the 70s and 80s had started thinking about the nature of privacy because of computerized databases and so forth. And they dove into the concept to say, what is privacy? Why is privacy important? But my own approach was rather a slightly different one, which was to say, here are all these things that are going on, and of course I've updated it over a period of time. And I notice that in response to these things, many people jump up and down and say, my privacy is being violated. I don't like it. I'm concerned about it. And so while as a philosopher I'm interested in conceptual clarity, I was also interested in trying to find a concept of privacy that would grapple with the reactions that people were having to try and understand what it was about these phenomena that was stirring these kinds of reactions. And so that was the purpose. Now, I'm trained as an analytic philosopher, and I want to do, this is just a little bit of the motivation. A lot of what analytic philosophers do is we take concepts that are important concepts. You could think about justice or freedom, and we say, yes, these are important, they're fundamental in many different ways. I mean, it doesn't have to be ethical concepts. It could be concepts like belief or knowledge or free will. And we understand that these concepts have accrued a lot of meaning. But in so doing, these natural concepts also have a lot of contradiction and messiness and blurriness. And so what a lot of the work of analytic philosophers is to take these concepts, and privacy is one of them, and say, what can we say that's rigorous, but at the same time captures the essence, something really important to people when they use the term privacy. And that's been my mission. When I talk about a meaningful concept of privacy, I'm using it to connect with the term privacy as it is used and as it is meaningful, but at the same time to lend some rigor to it. And that's what that's fundamental to the project of analytic philosophy. However, there's another step along the way, and that is communities like yourselves are thinking about privacy in technical terms, in theoretical terms. And therefore, the bridge is, there are multiple bridges to be created. And what I would like to do, what I'm really interested in doing, is to take the concepts that are meaningful to people, to create some rigor around those concepts, and then to see the extent to which the concept of privacy, as it's represented in the work of computer scientists, theorists, engineers, connects with what's meaningful. And I think it's really important to care about that, because if you want to make, and this I think gets a little bit, I won't explain, in detail, but gets at some of the frustration that I experienced watching Kobe's definitions, is that you want to have a concept that can be captured theoretically, technically, but it also has to be a concept that captures a lot of what people care about in the sphere of privacy. So that's the mission. Now, the talk outline goes as follows. Theory of contextual integrity, which I'm going to present as 4 theses. A little bit of applications to policy, social science, computer science, and engineering. And then these hopes and dreams. Bridging contextual integrity and technical research and practice, which I hope very much will be part of what happens, if not this week, then for the rest of the time that I'm here. Now, all the work that I'm going to talk about is very much influenced by collaborators. These are some of the significant collaborators along the way. And some of them are involved with the applications material. Some of them actually have really shaped the theory itself and guided some of the twists and turns that the theory has made, and I should say continues to make, because this, as you'll see, is far from a finished theory. So let's get to the first part, 4 essential claims. What I have found over the years of presenting contextual integrity is that reducing it in ways, hopefully, that communicate what it's about, is 4 essential claims, the positive claims, and then at each stage to contrast one of the positive claims, one of these positive theses, and they're cumulative, the theses, with what it's not. So in what ways does contextual integrity contrast with some of the predominant theories of privacy, be they technical or policy? So the first of the theses, and this is the most fundamental of the theses, if you disagree with this, you can leave the room. I mean, all right, no, yeah, I'm only checking. Okay, so the first one is to say that privacy, please don't use privacy when you mean secrecy. Secrecy says we're going to hold this no flow of this information. Now, a lot of times when you hear people talk, even this claim, privacy versus utility, I really want to correct people when they say this, because what they really mean is that there's a release of information and that people allow, they like, or they give it up, and they'll frame it as privacy is being diminished in favor of utility. And I would rather more precisely say information is released in favor of utility, not to confuse the flow of information with a reduction in privacy. And you'll often see, I know this is a theoretical crowd, but when I talk with the privacy engineering community, their mantra is data minimization. That's what they strive to achieve in any privacy by design. And I push back and I say, no, it's not about minimization, it's about appropriateness. And so that's really the beginning. Privacy is appropriate flow of information. And you're probably sitting there and saying, yeah, sure. What is appropriate flow? And here is the answer. Appropriate flow is flow conforming with entrenched contextual informational norms. And so now we're getting into the weeds of the theory. The idea is that we have expectations about how information will flow appropriately. And when something happens, let's say there's a technology, you have thermal imaging, and now you know, with this device you can see through walls whether, you know, the heating lamps on the other side, and we have now a disruptive flow, a flow that runs contrary to our expectations. And contextual integrity, the second thesis is that appropriate flow is flow that conforms with these entrenched expectations, which are called contextual informational norms. And of course, I'm going to say a lot more about them. Now, what's really important to note is what contextual integrity already is not, and that is, it doesn't go with procedural approaches to privacy, which say that it doesn't matter what it is, as long as you get consent, you haven't violated privacy. And the first, let's say, pillar of contextual integrity is to say that we have substantive norms. These norms or rules govern information flow, and even if you get consent, you may still be violating privacy. And by the way, the information can flow even if you don't get consent, even if people refuse. Yeah?
Can you give us an example?
Of
a contextual norm that is violated by some informed consent. I mean, there have been lots of privacy examples.
Yes.
Breaches that you can use.
Yes, yes. Can I hold the question until I've fleshed out the theory? Because, and please ask it again, because it's absolutely the right question to ask, to see how it applies in specific cases. Yes, what?
No, because, are you going to explain exactly what you mean by flow, information flow?
I think so. Let's see. You can tell me I haven't, and then we'll have to come back. All right, so now I want to emphasize this concept of contextual, because it's very much part of the theory, and you'll see how it plays out later on. And here I build on an assumption about the structure of society. It's not my own theory of society, but the idea is that social activity occurs not in this undifferentiated social space, but it's organized around social context. Now, I use the word context, but actually there are many philosophical theories and social theories that have generated other terms. And so you have Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about fields. You have Michael Walzer, who talks about spheres. You have people who talk about social domains. And I want to not rest the theory on any one of those accounts, but rather just take the fundamental assumption that we have different social spheres. And it's nothing very complicated. Even, the law recognizes these different domains. You'll ask people what kind of law they specialize in, and they may say constitutional, which has to do with the relationship of individuals to government. They may say, domestic or family law. They may say commercial law, etc. So we recognize these domains, and that's all that contextual integrity does. I've regretted 1,000 times using the word context because it's such a rich term and it's so ambiguous, but I was trying to avoid any of those other theory-laden terms. Contexts are defined by, or they're constituted by. It's not like there's a context and it has this stuff. It's that the context is constituted by certain features, such as what is the typical activities, what are the roles or the capacities in which people act in these contexts. And you might be a parent in one context, you might be a chief executive in another context, you might be a consumer in a third context. So these contexts are defined by the capacities. And then there are norms, there are expectations for how people behave in contexts. And I might add that you are all behaving very normatively in this context. And when people behave differently, we are surprised. So the idea of a norm is also just really quite a basic one, where we have certain expectations. The norms, if you will, if we want to formalize, we kind of capture the expectations, and then we can understand when those expectations are violated. Yeah?
Those norms will depend a lot on where you are, right? I mean, I'm sure if you're in China,
Yes.
if you work for the NSA, your norms might be quite
No. No, so yeah, so I would love to, can I do this? I just want to hold off for a sec. Because you'll see how this all, the fact that in China there are different norms is actually kind of proof of the theory. And hopefully I'll get to it. So now we get more into the model of the norm. What do these norms look like? Flow talks about the transmission of information from party to party. And when you describe this transmission, contextual integrity proposes 5 parameters for this norm. Actor parameters, which are subject, sender, and recipient. So when you're describing a flow, you need to assign values to these parameters, subject, sender, recipient. You need to describe, you need to say what the value of the information type parameter is. And then there's this thing called transmission principle, which gives me a headache. But okay, I think it's a very clever thing, and you'll see if you agree. All of these, subject, sender, recipient, information type, depend on the ontology that's given by the context. So if it's a medical context, then we have an understanding of what these information types are, what the likely subject, sender, and recipients are, and so we're expecting the parameters to range over those particular values.
Just a small clarification, is
Yes.
recipient the intended recipient or the actual recipient?
Well, good question, and I'm gonna get to it. No, I feel like I'm making all these promises, and I hope I do. Like, if I do get to it, you should say, okay, thank you, and otherwise you should okay. So again, we're back to this. This is what some of the dominant theories of privacy have tried to do. And here I'm talking about legal theories. They've tried, and some of the older philosophical theories, they've tried to say, look, clearly it's, informational, and by the way, it is informational privacy. I'm not talking about the right to, women's right to abortion and so forth. So we're talking about informational privacy. They've said, well, the right to privacy exists only for sensitive information. So we divide the world into a dichotomy. There's sensitive, and they believe, or the underlying claim now fleshed out in this language is to say the whole theory will hang on one parameter, and if you just tell me that this is sensitive information versus non-sensitive information, everything else follows. And what contextual integrity says is no, all of these 5 parameters matter. Subject control is not the only parameter that matters. All of them matter. So it's not, so you'll sometimes in technical circles, there'll be people who are interested in generating access control systems as a means. There's definitely a resemblance and a connection between access control or role-based access, but the important thing is that if you're guided by contextual integrity, you have to know what's going on with all of the 5 parameters. Sometimes you want to make a system that's less complex, so you might say, okay, let's hold fixed some of these parameters. We're only talking about patients as subjects and sort of reducing the complexity. And here's just to give you some concrete examples of what we have in mind with the various parameters. As you can see, it's quite, I hope, intuitive as to who these various, what the various values of the parameter are. But I want to talk a little bit about the transmission principle, because for many this is puzzling. And the idea of the transmission principle is that when you have information that flows from one party to another, there are the conditions or the constraints on the flow of that information from party to party. And here consent does come into the picture, because one transmission principle, arguably the most important transmission principle, is consent. So sometimes when, once you've fixed all the parameters, what's critical to saying that a flow is appropriate is to be able to say that there was subject consent. Another one that's very important is notice. So sometimes we may say, we don't need consent, like with CCTV cameras. We might say, in England, you might have seen lots of notices that says this area is monitored by CCTV. That's a case in which there's no consent, but the law requires notice. But the other transmission principles, and I think that was somebody's question, where if you're, April is in a couple of months, assuming the government is open, you will have to file your tax returns, and they will say to you, what was your gross annual earnings? And you cannot say, sorry, I'm not letting you know about that. Or if you're a witness in a court of law, the judge will insist that you answer questions. So coercion can be a transmission principle. And there are other transmission principles, like buying and selling. Sometimes you share information in confidence, as you might do with your physician, sometimes not. And so we have these expectations, and we're trying to capture the expectations, but the transmission principle is very important. And for anybody, again, to get the intuition of it, I have this particular case of people going shopping, trying on shirts. You find one you love, you try it on, you love it, you just walk out of the store. So what's going to happen if that happens?
Alarm rings.
Alarm rings. Thank you. Just checking that you're awake. Because what haven't you done?
Yeah,
That's right. They just charge us your credit card when you walk out.
You're just too smart for your own good. Okay, so there has to be some kind of transmission principle, and that is that you pay. And after you pay, it becomes owned. It's no longer owned by the store. It's now owned by you, and we've had a transmission of ownership but it requires the payment for that to happen. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand. Is the principle supposed to be subjective or objective? Is it both actors, the sender and the reception, are we assuming for them it's an objective thing? They agree on that principle?
No, you don't have to agree. So when we're talking about norms, we're talking about rules that govern. And sometimes there would be a buy-in or an agreement among the different parties, but we're talking about the expected flows. And sometimes that may have nothing to do with the different parties who are actually involved in the exchange. Another one that we know very well is with a warrant. So let's say the police suspect that there's some documents in your home that may contain some useful information to incriminate you. They can't just barge into your home. We have a rule that says you have to go to a judge, you need to get a warrant or a subpoena. I think the subpoena you get from the magistrate. And then once you have it, you can get that information. And so we have these transmission principles that are very important that we've devised in order to meet certain value requirements. And that too is a transmission principle. You can authorize transmission. Sometimes the flow of information is reciprocal, like when friends chat, when you go to the physician is requesting your physical information. You're not talking to the physician and saying, well, how's that back of yours? I hear you injured it. There's no reciprocity in that way. Here are just some kind of contrived examples that show the ways in which, if you fleshed out the norm in concrete terms, this is what they look like, and hopefully there's no surprise there. So,
Can I, sorry.
Sure.
So, are these contextual information norms transmission principles? I'm just trying to make sure I got the right
Yeah, and that's important for me to emphasize, which is the transmission principle is just that it sits within the norm. The norm is describing the flow with the various the values for the parameters set. And one of them is the transmission principle.
So is the transmission principle the means by which the information is transferred? Is it this set of cultural norms?
It's the constraint. No. There's nothing normative about it. It's a purely descriptive notion. It's
constraint that describes how and why the information is.
No why.
No why.
Just how.
Just how.
It's the conditions under which the information flows. It flows under these conditions.
Can you put it back in the slide, previous slide?
This one?
So it seems like these transmission principles like cover lots of different things, and that it's not clear they all like are of the same type. For example, the in confidence part seems really to be about other flows.
Yes.
Right? It's
Yes.
not actually about this one. It's saying or
Yes. It's a condition. It's like a future constraint on the flow. And I'm going to move on, but I am going to put a pin in this and say that this continues to be work, because in some loose account of the transmission principle, the numbers of transmission principles can explode indefinitely. And while I have very strong intuitions about some of them, I'm just not sure how to keep all of them out of the gate. So yeah.
So to me, the differentiation is something that is verifiable. It's like a contract that you write under which the transmission is allowed. Mm-hmm. And then some of them, like the coercion or the stealing, maybe more so, seems very different.
Seem what?
Seem very different. So if I wanted to think of this written as a program or something that I could kind of code, as something as a condition.
Right. So you're saying that some of it in order to call this a stealing rather than a whatever else, you need to know some extraneous information. You can't capture everything about the transmission principle with information like non-moral information. And this, it's actually, I don't know, Kobe, if some bells are going off, but the question often with myself and computer science colleagues is to say how much of the work can be done in the program and how much of it has to be done externally to the program, where you fix certain conditions beforehand so that you can give an interpretation of what's going on in the program only after you have done some labeling outside of it. I mean, I think that this is a fascinating question just generally.
Can inference also be a transmission principle? Because in inference...
Okay, now I'm not answering that. That's too hard. No, because we'll get to it. Yeah.
Which actor is the one that determines which transmission principles?
No actor, except if it is one of the transmission principles.
What if the two actors don't agree on which transmission principles at play?
Please let me move. Because it could well be that you have a debate in society. These are not, see, this is really important. It's actually an important feature of contextual integrity, which is that it's not interested in preferences. It doesn't see information flows as flows that people like or dislike. It's about societal expectations that we absorb. For instance, if you're applying for a job and they ask what grade you got in C++ programming and you got a D, you may not want to give that information, but it's required by the circumstances. And so that's contextual integrity wants to talk about the norms, not about now. There's important work that tries to get at what people's preferences are, but what we want are more like expectations and judgments. You wouldn't be shocked when they asked you that. Okay, I see, Frauke.
I'll hold it.
Actually, say what it is, and then
okay.
if it's easy, I'll answer it.
Yeah, just what you just said at the very end reminds me of one of the questions you asked yesterday to the presenters from Google around Google Chrome and things like that.
Right.
Would you say that that there are spaces currently where some of the turmoil we see about privacy is because there aren't norms yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There aren't norms yet, then they're contested, and now and the theory has something to say about it. Again, when you started your talk yesterday and you said, what were the cases that you were testing our intuitions?
TCS positive.
TCS positive.
Okay, Kobe is TCS positive, and you said, is this okay to reveal this information? And people said yes, no, whatever. And I'm sitting there saying, you haven't finished that question. Released to who? Under what conditions? I can't answer a privacy question unless you fill out all the parameters. And there probably are some assumptions people are making. And I have now a series of 3 studies. This was the first one with Kirsten Martin, in which we tried to reveal that actually people's judgments, predictions, expectations of privacy really do depend on more than the parameters than we're giving them credit for. And so in this work, this was the first of them, we decided to focus on information that was judged to be sensitive. And so we went back and we redid a study that the Pew group had done, the Pew Foundation, about what information people consider to be sensitive. And our results were the same. When you just ask people to adjudicate sensitivity of information, Social Security is like way off the charts, health, phone conversations, email are the most, and then we focused on those. And then here are the other ones. But then what we did, using a method, Kirsten is the empirical expert, and she's coming to the workshop at Stanford, I'm happy to say. We added parameters to the question. And so even though people were kind of similar in how they judged health information, when you said your physician or, a store gets the health information, how many people are shocked that there's enormous divergence in whether people thought that this was okay? By the way, we always like, would you like it? No, we try not to ask it that way. We try to say, is it okay? Because we're trying to get at norms, not at preferences. It turns out that it's actually very hard to get at it, and I'm hoping that at that workshop we'll kind of learn how to ask the questions so that we get back what we want and what we need. But you can see that you can't tell the whole story without specifying who the recipients are and what the transmission principles and so forth are. And we did something very similar with information that was held in public records to show that even though we're dealing with information in public records, people show that they have wildly different expectations depending on how you fill the parameters. And anybody who followed the whole story with Kobach wanting to get voter registration information, which in most states is public information, and in fact whether you voted in the most recent election is public information in the sense that it's in a public record, people objected to it quite vociferously. Now this kind of, I think this is going to address maybe a question you asked, which is, what work is this norm structure doing? And it's doing twofold work. One, it can do twofold work. One is as a descriptive mechanism. So if you're building a system of some kind and you want to describe the information flows, my suggestion is that you describe the flow, you flesh out the flow in terms of all these parameters. In order to give a comprehensive flow that is going to be relevant to people's judgment as to whether privacy has been respected or not, you can use this particular norm structure as a descriptive mechanism. If you want to describe practices, you can use this structure to describe those flows in ways that will be useful to the next step. Or, and I think this was your question, if you want to judge whether a given flow is acceptable or not, you measure it against norms, like rules, which are prescriptive. So what we say is the flows ought to resemble and they ought not to violate this particular flow that we know to be entrenched in a certain context. So I think it does both jobs. Now, pausing there for a second, I don't know, this was just some slide that I wrote up where I thought, how does this particular philosophical theory connect with some of the work that's going on in computer science and engineering? And I'll confess, or it's probably evident to you in the audience, that I've done less work with, or hardly any work, with theorists and people who are experts in differential privacy. And I'm really, really interested to figure out, are these competing theories? Are there ways that each of them complement the other? How can they be useful to each other? And of course, it's not only differential privacy, but there are other ways in which cryptographically based efforts to protect privacy, how do they connect up with a theory like contextual integrity? So I'm not going to read everything there, but I'm just assuming that while I'm talking, you've been reading it. Okay, and not your email. So here are some of the applications that we have done. So with Deborah Estrin, we were looking at these so-called small data applications. This is pain management applications. And from doing that work, we developed this kind of visualization technique to map data flows. This is for like a ridiculously simple app, and you can see what goes on. And what's helpful then is to see kind of leakage of information in unexpected ways, even to the developers who were saying, for convenience, let's just use, Google authentication, the Google sign-in. And then we were like, well, do you know what information flows when you use this particular API? And they were, oops, no. So the visualization helps people map out the data flows. This is very early work. really, it was, for me, it was eye-opening because at the time I was working on contextual integrity as a philosophical theory, and I was part of a big NSF project, and I had presented this to the large group, and John Mitchell was in the audience, Anupam Datta, and they had an idea that you could take these norms and formalize them, and they developed a formal policy language, and then later on Anupam and his collaborators, and Michael Chance has been part of this effort as well, to look at, we looked at the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, we looked at, I was not part of this project, we looked at the HIPAA, but what's really interesting about this, I like this one in particular because it's like a covered entity. Those are the capacity, those are the actors within that are governed by HIPAA, like a hospital, a physician, and so on, can disclose a patient's psychotherapy notes to the patient only with prior approval from the patient's psychiatrist. So in that's another case where consent is not the sufficient condition for data flow, but you need the approval of this additional, so that's identifying the transmission principle. And it turned out that contextual integrity was incredibly useful for doing this work, except for one thing that was really missing, and that's another thing that has to be part of the next phase, which is that there was very much, use was a parameter. It was just clear that you could do, this flow could happen only if it was used in the following way. And contextual integrity, I'd always fought and said, no, we don't need the 6 parameters. I think the 5 we have are perfectly fine. Thank you very much. And now I'm increasingly thinking that we actually do. And one of them is related to a question that somebody asked, which is that we have a host of new actors in society, the platforms, for example, that don't have 1,000 years of history for us to learn what the appropriate flows of information are. And so use becomes really an important parameter in the situation in which we find ourselves now. So I'm just going to, put a pin in that. Some work with systems people trying to create some data leakage protections that's based on contextual integrity. And a group of us, 3 of us, have done a survey of some of the work that's, yeah.
Actually, I had a question on the previous slide. A quick one, I hope. Still that. My hand was, I was getting it.
Sorry.
I just wanted, since you put that up there, to ask you, because I think I'm missing something about what's the sort of virtue of this formal policy language? Because that seems like a very strange construction to me, in that it has this sort of like veneer of mathematical rigor of, for all p, which, if it's for all p that are an element of R or a rational number, like, I know what we're talking about. But if you have for all p who are psychiatrists, then you have like all of the analytical loosiness of plain English that gets like reintroduced there. So like, why this like half mathematical language? Like, what does that aim to accomplish?
Yeah, and I think this connects a little bit to Shafi's question, which is that some of this, we're going to have to, what we care about is flow of information in society. And this will allow us a way to potentially embed some of the constraints within a system of information, like information flow within an organization or between different organizations. It could be government or health insurance companies and hospitals and so forth. So you're trying to do it. If you have an inclination to automate this flow, then you might use sentences like this to then describe the constraints in a language that the computer understands. But in order to then enforce this with the real world, you are going to need some way to represent the various parties, like psychiatrists, in the internal mechanisms of the system itself. And that step may or may not be able to be internalized. So for example, I'm going to take you away from this in just something where people are trying to make that connection in a technical way. If you have your iPhone, in creating a biometric where you press your thumb and it knows it's you, what we've done here is we've created a link between something that's flesh and messy and all of that, and we now have a representation of that now the system can grasp in the languages with which it operates. So I don't know, this is a grand philosophical point. I have like one huge chunk that I have to get done before I finish. So can I just put it on hold? Don't look so sad. Okay, all right. So this is the part that I want to get to. And that is, like we all know, that what I've just told you is an incredibly conservative theory. I've said that flows have to conform with entrenched norms. And now we're all sitting there and saying, oh my God, everything that we know about digital technologies is that they challenge entrenched flows, that we do things differently. And now contextual integrity seems to say, if you don't do it the old way, then it violates contextual integrity. And so we need to have something else. We need to say, it's true that at a first step, and this is like a default condition, that if it respects the entrenched norms, yay, but if it doesn't, what do we do about it? And the answer is that there's so many of these conflicts, and by the way, there's nothing new about norms changing in society over time. I think we've seen some massive normative changes in our own, even within our own lifetimes, so we shouldn't be surprised about that. And what the aim of contextual integrity needs to be, it needs to give an account of not only the norms that are entrenched, which we can perhaps discover through empirical means by surveys and interviews and looking at law that seems steady law. They're multiple anthropologically. And by the way, getting to the question that you asked, what this will show actually is that when people say, oh, privacy is not a human right because look, this society believes this and that society believes that, contextual integrity says, yes, that is exactly how it should be. There should not be a universal set of norms from culture to culture as long as there are fundamental differences in the organization of those societies. So instead of entrenched, the idea is we need some way to do an ethical analysis to figure out when you have a conflict, or maybe, as I think somebody mentioned, the information flows that we didn't even dream about, and therefore we don't even have norms for them. Who had a norm for seeing through walls? We didn't have that because we couldn't do it. And so we have to have some way of performing an ethical-based analysis to get at what the legitimate contextual norms might be in some of these cases of conflict or some of these absolutely novel cases. Now, what contextual integrity proposes is that there are different layers of analysis that one can do. There's to look at interests and preferences of affected parties. Now, a lot of politics and a lot of marketing does this and then it stops. And we know that issues of fairness aren't dealt with at this level. Tyranny of the majority and so forth. So the next layer of analysis looks at ethical and political principles and values. And here I refer to fantastic work that's done by my colleagues in law and philosophy who ask the question, what is the value of privacy? It protects freedom, it protects autonomy, freedom of speech, and fairness and non-discrimination. So we look at that. But the part that I'm going to just dwell on for a moment is the contextual functions, purpose, and values. Because when I was describing context to you, I didn't do a full job of it. What I didn't say is that you might even say constitutive of the context are its purposes. If you go to a school and you're not told that this is a place of learning, or whatever those purposes are in a different society, you know, creation of future citizens or development of a workforce, you don't know what a school is. And so contexts are defined by their purposes, and also you can think about values as constraints. So physicians would like, and maybe in some senses they're limited, to provide health care irrespective of financial wealth. Our purpose is to make a society more healthy, alleviate pain, prolong life, blah, blah, blah. And we do it, it doesn't matter what your salary is, we do it equally. And so the non-discrimination is a value of the healthcare context. And functions are, functions within the context in order to promote the purposes and values. So what becomes, and this again I think will address some of the concerns people had, is that privacy is not only about the individual. We protect privacy. When we say, like, why is privacy important? Why should we? So again, listening to talks on differential privacy, locally provided, always at the back of my mind is that the only way, or homomorphic encryption, the only way these are going to work is if you can get all the parties to buy in. And the only way you're going to get the parties to buy in is if they all agree that privacy is important. And one of the commitments, and again, this is a fundamental commitment of contextual integrity, rises or falls on this, which is that privacy is a societal value and it makes societies better, not only the lives of the individual data subjects. So, privacy is not always contrary to utility. Just wanted to get that one in. Here are just some examples of purpose and values. And one thing that I would say is that when we have these societal debates about what to do, should facial recognition technology be used by commercial actors, I want to argue that the people we need around the table are not only the privacy experts, we need the area experts. In education, it shouldn't only be the legislators, it shouldn't be the computer scientists, it shouldn't be the philosophers of privacy, it should be school superintendents, it should be people who teach, it should be parents, it should be everybody who cares about education and what the purposes of an educational system are. And this I love to use. I use it, I think, in every talk I give on contextual integrity, which is just kind of an interesting historical case where Andrew Mellon was trying to persuade, I think must have been Congress, to take tax records and make them confidential. And he doesn't say, oh, this is to be nice to individuals, this is going to protect them. It's to say the Treasury will suffer if rich people have to divulge their earnings. So if we make it confidential, they're more likely to honestly say what they've earned. So here we are. Privacy required. This is a summary that actions, practices, and policies conform with legitimate contextual or privacy norms. This was just some ideas of the fields of computer science.
The quote is definitely not true.
Which one?
Well, maybe
Not the quote, I guess apparently it was said, but clearly you could argue the opposite.
yes, and I know of a few very specific cases where I think we're all cursing that particular thing. It was just interesting that the argument to persuade it was that. So I think that if we look at the ways of enforcing contextual integrity, representing it within systems, making sure that certain flows happen or not happen, I have worked with people, or I have dreamed about some of these areas of expertise coming into the particular mission, and I'm just going to stop with this slide as a summary slide, and I would love to take Adam's question if he still is prepared to ask it. But anyway, that's all I'm going to talk about.
We do have 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
Just back to the quote for a second. When you had that up, you were talking about confidentiality. And I haven't heard you use that word in the rest of the talk. And I was wondering if in your framework that is an important distinction between privacy and confidentiality, or?
Well, I think of confidentiality as a transmission principle. Okay. And then privacy is so it's about that little hop, but not about, yeah.
Just to make sure I understand, so contextual integrity gives some kind of framework in order to, for a system, define some kind of blueprint according to which the information flow what it should do. But does it say anything in case, of course, something's going to go wrong and one of the particular norms will be violated? Does it say what should happen to the others, for example? Is there a way to do that?
You mean...
say a psychiatrist does not actually respect confidentiality, then does it say how the whole system should react?
No, no. I mean, it again, depending on where you're going to put the enforcement, you could and I mean, depending where it may be that all you can do is audit a system. I mean, if you're lucky, you can audit, and then you might. Let's say I send you an email that says confidential, and then you forward that email. Just to give you a kind of normal sort of case, then it could be that in order to try and enforce these norms, your system would monitor. And then it might complain to the blah, blah, and then you might lose your account. So some of that punishment might happen. Or what we want to try and do with vaccine is actually anticipate and actually block some of those actions. And it gets... it gets back to this question of that connection of human and the representation of that human in the machine, how well you can do it, how much work happens within, how much work. Yeah. Adam.
I guess I had 2 questions. One was about maybe the easier one first. Is there a way that within the kind of language you have to talk about the extent to which people understand the transmission principles at work, especially where transmission principles are about future disclosures or future transmissions, right?
Yeah.
For example, I click on an ad, I may not understand that information is recorded, it's tied to my, my identity, it's used in the future to show me, decide what other ads to show me, whatever that is, sold to other people. To what extent does that, the limits of people's understanding of the context fold into this type of description?
You mean whether
description?
Like whether, I mean, that's just as a matter of how you set your system up. I'm not sure.
I guess I'm getting, it seems like it's fundamental to these notions of norms in evolving when technology evolves.
Yes.
Because if I don't understand, something that is, the way that the flow is described to me will change the way, whether or not I feel it is violating contextual norms.
Yes.
And so it seems like one of the sort of important parameters that seems orthogonal to this way of describing things is how much the people involved, be they subjects or senders or recipients, actually understand what what's going on.
Yes. Yes, and this is part of the struggle over privacy policies. That the ongoing, I don't know, is that surprising to you?
No. What I'm asking is, like, where does it fit into your script? Like, I don't see it.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't fit in the sense that the only thing I can respond to you is to say, when you're describing to people the flow, make sure that you mention all of these things and now possibly use as well.
To do that, if I'm a company that buys and sells information, like I'm not sure if maybe it's just completely orthogonal.
No, so it's not. Yes and no. So some of the work that we're doing at the moment is, I know, like everybody and their brother is like analyzing privacy policies, but we're doing some large-scale work looking at privacy policies and showing that some of, like, say, Facebook's privacy policy has virtually, like, if you look at how you would spell it out, it has like endless possibilities of who the recipients could be. These are open-ended, the way they are saying what's going on with the flows. So all we can do from this theory is to say, look, we think people need to know this. Your policies are nowhere near doing this. Lawmakers, do something about it. I don't think the marketplace is going to, I don't know, I feel like, am I not getting at the...
No, I'll let maybe other people follow up on that, and I'll ask my other question, which is that the way you describe flow at the very beginning, and this maybe gets to Kobe's question about inference.
Yes, I wanted to get there.
Sort of, for lack of a better word, atomic flows, where information are data in the original sense of, like, units in indivisible units that are moved around. They're records.
Well, they're abstract. They are abstractions. The norms are abstractions, but yes, what we're looking at are particular flows of. They govern particular units, if you will, of flow of certain information type from party to party.
Okay. I guess my question is, how fundamentally would one have to rewrite the theory to take into account flows that don't have that atomic flavor? So, for example, inferences made based on seeing many aggregate statistics or things like that. It was a question, right? So, to what extent is it possible to fold that into the current framework, or to what extent would the framework need to be, extended, changed?
So when you say aggregate statistics, you're saying that whatever this property is, you're saying
I was going to ask
Adam almost always.
Maybe,
no, but I want to talk. Okay, I want to talk about.
that same question that
Yes.
Because I was going to ask the exact same thing. Say the sum total of your movements in public, right?
Okay.
That's something that there's not a moment of transmission, that, like, here's everywhere I've been for the last month. Like, there's not one moment where, in an information theoretic sense, like,
It doesn't have to be one moment. No.
I think that's a very
No, I'm not sure that that's what Adam was.
What Adam
exactly.
is describing is,
Yeah.
if, let's take the Facebook example since you mentioned it earlier. If based on your activities on a platform, that looks like activities of others on the platform to whom additional information is available, there's some inference about you.
Right.
This is not the piece of information that you gave, the inference piece.
Yes.
So you didn't send this, and yet something will happen with that piece of information on you, right? Is that, Adam,
Well, I don't. I'm okay. By the way, so I think it still doesn't get at some of the really challenging inference questions. By the way, I have a paper that's not yet out. It's called Contextual Integrity Up and Down the Data Food Chain. And it grapples exactly with some of these inference questions. But when, if on the basis of a bunch of observable information, based on aggregate information, I might infer whatever, that you have cancer. Then we now have we have a flow in the same way, I don't know, the target case has gone through so many iterations, and now people believe that it's false. But that I observed the hand creams that you buy, and now I will share information that you're pregnant. It's not so much that it comes from the data subject. The center could be, but if we have a norm that says this flow is contrary to societal expectation, that red flag is going to be raised. And here, and Shafi, I see, do you want to intervene? Do you want to interject in the discussion? Because
I was just going to say that, in some sense, you're saying that there are norms. For example, like your example about seeing through walls. You know, now there are all these sensors and see-through walls. People do that because, let's say, in old folks' home or whatever, because they want to. What do you want? You want that if you're in danger, information will be released. If you're in danger, it's not a picture, it's processing of that information, then a determination that some threshold has been passed. So, and then you're willing. So I think it's related to the discussion, because let's say that this aggregate indicates danger. Or then you might say that's a societal value to which I'm willing to, whether you can code that up, I don't know. But if you did, you might say that that's okay. And that's a flow, that's inference.
Exactly. Thank you. I mean, that really helps me make this a couple of points, not to get to the heart of the concern, which is that it's not just the transmission principle.
It's based on the data itself.
It's not just the data, but it's the purposes that are served by certain flows of information. That's what you've just outlined when you've said to save a life, or you know, whatever it is. We're showing that it's dependent on these various factors. So, I mean, I'm all on board with that, and that is sometimes how we change expectations. So maybe Hippocrates says, you know, you shouldn't ever share anything you've ever seen. And now, you know, in this day and age, we know there are contagious diseases. We know there are restaurants that serve toxic foods. And so we have to alter that, you know, entrenched norm that had some very good rationale behind it to something else that does a better job of meeting the contextual functions and purposes. Now, in terms of, just to wave a hand, because this is like a whole nother discussion, what about inference, especially in these days of big data and machine learning and so forth? Because what happens, and I think that this is what I see as the crux of it, that we have these norms that maybe they allow certain flows of information, but taken the information that flows very in acceptable ways, but when you accumulate all that data together, you can draw inferences that violate norms and expectations, or at least they don't conform with these expectations, because sometimes what we discover is just like, my God, I don't even have a norm for it. In the old days, we were able to, when these sorts of things happen slowly enough, you know, you had scientists performed experiments, controlled experiments, and we discovered that if someone has a mole that looks like this, then it's most likely cancerous. And then we maybe update the norms of flow. So I think social security number was a case in point. Social security number was just a number. It wasn't sensitive. But suddenly when people started attaching social security number to many other factors, because it was convenient, you could use social security number to aggregate, and as a matter of fact, it could be used to, you know, to perform identity theft, and it became, all of a sudden, if you want to know why social security numbers off the charts in terms of how people judge it sensitive, we've had a radical change. We had, over the years, a radical shift in our expectations regarding social. We had time to get the publicity out that said, hey, you know, don't reveal. But nowadays, the discoveries through these mechanisms of big data and machine learning, I don't know whether, I'm not sure whether we can update the norms fast enough. And I think we have to go with what I think you were suggesting, although, you know, in a very specific way, is that we need some means to challenge the function and in service of what values we need to, and that's also like some work that I'm doing with some political philosophers to figure out this issue of legitimacy. I don't know that we can use the norms in some of those, and maybe Adam, you were trying to get at some of those difficult questions, and I know that Kobe, this is a great concern. Am I right?
Yeah, so
yeah.
Can I ask one more question? So I think, and this is also based on our discussion from 3 days ago.
Yeah.
So, we define the way that we see norms, and in your theory, in contextual integrity, norms are rules about how information could be transferred or used. But these rules don't, but in my presentation yesterday, I put a focus on like this goal that the privacy concept would also have consequences to informational harms and so on. And differential privacy has some of this flavor. So it's not a rule, it's a framework for thinking and analyzing privacy of mechanisms. And for example, we could think that the information that Latanya Sweeney used was published then in a way that matched the norm, the rule. The rule was just you should strip off this identifying information, and hence, because everything was according to the rules, I don't see where the norm was broken. Okay? Whereas if the norm was not about what you should do, but what the consequences should be, then I could see that the norm was, you know, breached. Okay. So I think this is one issue I have with the theory as is that it's very hard to say, okay, we have the rules, but what does it mean? How does that actually protect our privacy? It does probably in places where the rules were, you know, throughout the years have, you know, evolved to actually be good rules. But in the way the world looks like now, things are changing so fast, it's not clear that these rules are still what we should pursue. And have you looked at norms in terms of not what the rules should be, but what the goals should be, what is it that we're trying to protect, then maybe we could continue using these norms even when the world is changing.
I'm not sure that I disagree, except with what the goals. When you say the goals, you're saying maybe privacy. But I'm saying the goals that we need to look at, the reason that certain rules, if you look historically, why is it that we have the norms we have? We can look historically and say, I can explain why these rules were good, but I can also explain why in hundreds of years later, these rules need to give way to other rules, but not just here, in my view, are the goals and the values and the purposes. This, not privacy, these other things. And I don't know if we disagree on that, but I can see Adam getting agitated, and everyone wants their coffee.
I wanted to, encourage further discussion during the coffee break so that people get a little bit
and we've got,